Welcome to the Dr. Berkson's Best Health Radio Show. What an incredible time we have right now on our planet. This is another show on COVID, but getting at it not from a treatment aspect, but from how it got to the point where you and I are all experiencing the shutdown of our society that we are. Who we have on the show today to explain all this is quite an extraordinary person. This is her second time on the show. Her name is Dr. Mary J. Ruwart. She's a research scientist, an ethicist, a libertarian author and activist. And she is also a very cool girlfriend. When I had her, she wrote a book that's one of the best books. You should have it in your home reference. Honestly, it's fantastic. It's called Death by Regulation. And it's all about the details of how the FDA has ended up mainly passing synthetic medication, and that it's a very expensive route. And she put this book together in such a beautiful way. And I bumped into this book and bumped into her and realized the book was launching. And I called her up and said, I'm going to do whatever I can do to get this book out there. So I interviewed her and we really hit it off. And we started kind of hanging out on the phone and by email. And I said, boy, I wish if you just lived closer, you'd be a really good girlfriend because you're so friggin' cool. So she said, I do live close. I'm only about an hour and a half away from you. Well, that was that. I invited her over. She stayed here for a weekend. She loves to eat my food and I love to cook my food. And recently she was kind enough. She also takes feral cats and gets them ready for fostering and adoption with a cat shelter close to where she lives. And the other day she brought a kitty cat over for me and I made this lavish meal in return for her. So we have this heart to heart plus smart to smart connection. And that's so cool. And when she was here the other day having lunch, we decided that this was a show that needed to be. And the topic of the show is how the FDA made the COVID crisis worse and what we can do about it. But I just want to give you a little background. I don't want to take up too much more time on the introduction. But just so you know, she's got her Ph.D. in Biophysics, and then she joined the Department of Surgery at St. Louis University. And she later on took a position with the Upjohn Company of Kalamazoo. And as a senior research scientist, she's been very involved throughout most of her career in developing new therapies for a variety of diseases with a specialty on liver cirrhosis and AIDS. But she has a lot to do with regulating IRBs, which allow people to do research. And she's been an adjunct professor of biology at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. But she's also served, this is very cool, with the Center for Applied and Professional Ethics. So where's the ethics in this whole COVID issue? What's going on? That's why we have her on the show. So there she is sitting in Burnett, Texas, and she's gorgeous. She's really a sister of my heart. Hi, Mary, Dr. Ruwart.
Hi, Lindsay. I'm glad to be here.
So we were chatting at lunch and I said, we got to do a show on this. So walk us through this, would you please?
Sure. Well, a lot of people don't realize that a great deal of the COVID crisis, at least in the U.S., could have been handled without shutting us down economically, keeping us out of our jobs. And the reason that we aren't able to do that and have only social distancing left is because the FDA made it very difficult for us to get test kits, protective gear, and hand sanitizer. For example, on February 4th, even though we had a lot of domestic companies working on making diagnostic kits for the COVID, what happened was the FDA said, can't use those. The only kits you can use are the ones from the Center for Disease Control, CDC. And
the other kits were from where? From Germany, the World Health Organization?
Well, Germany did offer to send us kits. It sent 250,000 kits to the World Health Organization. It could have supplied us. We could have imported them, except the FDA forbade it. And of course, our domestic manufacturers, our diagnostic people were already trying to develop something for the coronavirus because they saw what was happening in Europe. But the FDA said, no, the only kit you're going to be able to use here in the US is the CDC's. And unfortunately, that kit didn't even work. So what ended up happening is we were 6 weeks without test kits, except the ones that were sort of bootlegged or smuggled in by the hospitals, which, of course, they guarded very carefully because they didn't have very many of them. Finally, the FDA relented.
Wait, just 1 second. It seems kind of incredulous that the FDA's kit didn't work. And I've read what the botched stuff was. Can you just summarize that for us? Like, why in the world would the FDA's kits not work?
Well, actually, it was the CDC's kit.
I mean, the CDC's kit.
Yeah, the FDA said you can only use the CDC's kit. And from what I understand, they had actually several problems. One were the reagents themselves. The other was they weren't automated, which is just shocking in today's research arena. You know, all the diagnostic companies do their kits. When you send your kits in, what happens is you get an automated assay because then you can have a lot of throughput. If you don't have an automated assay, things are pretty slow. So they had to recall all the CDC's kits. And then when the FDA finally relented, I think it was on March 17th, and said, okay, we can have domestic manufacture, we can have importation. And you don't even need to tell us about it or get our approval until 15 days after you start using them. Which, okay, so all of a sudden we went from, intense regulation to no regulation. And so, of course, several companies actually sent out home test kits. There were quite a few of them, actually. I think they had several hundred, if not thousands, of kits that had gone into people's homes. And the FDA said, wait, no, can't do that. No home testing. People might not know how to take nasal swabs, so you have to tell everyone you send a kit to that you cannot send them results. And so that's what ended up happening. All those kits were recalled. And there were similar restrictions on importation and domestic production by companies that hadn't already started making protective gear. So in other words, we couldn't import protective gear. We couldn't make it domestically except for the companies that were already in business to do it. So our healthcare workers ended up having to reuse disposable gowns and masks and things of that nature. And of course, it was almost impossible for several weeks for the average person to get these things. Again, finally, the FDA relented and let us import those and let us have new domestic producers go ahead and try to get them to the hospitals and the people. And something similar happened with hand sanitizer. In the first few weeks, it was hard to get hand sanitizer. So the people who distill whiskey and other spirits said, hey, we've got the equipment. We are going to produce enough to satisfy the whole country. One problem, they were going to use regular drinking ethanol, which they had, instead of isopropanol, which is what is normally in the hand sanitizer. Now, you can't drink isopropanol, it'll poison you. So the FDA said, nope, wait, can't do that, because distillers, if you put these things out, people are going to drink it. So you have to put this additive in it that'll poison it. So if they drink it, they'll get sick. The only thing is the additive would have contaminated their machinery. They would not have been able to clean it sufficiently to meet the FDA regulations when they wanted to go back to whiskey distilling. But some didn't pay any attention to this and did it anyway, which I think is a good thing.
Why? So in your opinion, because, your last book was Death by Regulation, about how the FDA has metastasized and become what it has. In your opinion, why did the FDA take the stance that it did?
Well, it wants control of everything. It wants to put its approval on everything that goes out, whether it's a diagnostic kit, whether it's protective gear, whether it's hand sanitizer. If you already know, I'm sure you've talked about this on your shows, if you have some nutritional treatment for a disease, you have to be very careful how you talk about it, or you can go to prison, because the FDA does not allow you to make statements about the healing properties of different vitamins, minerals, etc., unless you go through their 14 years of hoop jumping to convince them that, yes, in fact, it works. And of course, that is a very expensive process.
Can you summarize in a bit what you wrote about so beautifully, so elegantly? I mean, I'm not just saying this because you're my girlfriend now. I thought this book was one of the best books I've ever read. Can you just summarize a little bit how the FDA got to the position that it has?
Sure. Well, in 1962, Congress passed additional powers to the FDA. It's so the FDA now, instead of just making sure everything was, quote, safe, now had to show that it was effective. And they decided to choose a very high standard for that. So instead of taking 4 years to get from the lab bench to the marketplace, new drugs took, by the end of the century, or the end of the last century, about 14 years. And even though
and a lot of money.
And a lot of money, yes. In fact, even though it still takes between 10 and 14 years on average to get a drug to market, because the manufacturers are always trying to shorten that timeline by doubling up on studies and things, the cost is going up exponentially every year. So if you look at the cost of getting FDA approval and plot it on a graph against the average thing we pay at the pharmacy for new drugs, you see there's a direct correlation, which makes perfect sense. If the manufacturers have to pay more for FDA approval, which is their biggest cost, then they're going to have to charge more.
Which means that natural answers that are less expensive and potentially less dangerous never are going to make it within that system.
That's right, because the only way the companies can recoup the cost of getting FDA approval is to have a patent, which, when I first was working for the Upjohn Company, we actually developed some things without patents, including natural products. I started out in the natural product division. And, we were looking at prostaglandins, which are natural hormones that every cell in your body makes. They're also called eicosanoids today. You take fish oil in order to get the good ones made. And, we were some of the world's leaders in this field. So, it's very impossible today, though, to develop something without a patent and think that you're going to actually recoup your costs. Even today, 2 or 3 drugs out of 10 recoup their costs, which means the whole industry is dependent on blockbusters, which is really unsustainable.
So, what do you think should have been done? And what can we listening to this show do? And what's the good news behind all this? Because it's a lot more bad news. It makes us very, we look at our government, we say, hey, we pay our taxes. We're a good citizen. I obey the laws. And here my government let me down. My government shut down the economy. My government put me at more risk because we don't know who is positive and who isn't. So I don't want to think that way. I don't want to move through my world having it be just a dark world. So what do you think the FDA could have done? And what do you think might be the silver lining that comes out of all this?
Well, what the FDA could have done is not banned test kits that were imported, for one thing. Certainly not drag their feet in approving other domestic kits, and certainly not recalling all the home test kits, because even if some people didn't do a good nasal swab, they might get a false negative, but at least some people would have found out that they had COVID early on and been able to treat it. And of course,
or been able to isolate so they didn't spread it around as an asymptomatic carrier. Right.
Well, and protective gear. That's very important for our healthcare workers because they're exposed to this stuff every day.
Right.
It's
so
also
many of them
important.
Are tragically getting ill. Oh my God.
Yes. And for us too. I mean, what if we all had face masks and gloves and things like that? We could have, at least some of us could have gone out and gone to work knowing that at least we had some protection. And there's a lot of places that are still working and they don't always have these protections until recently when it was again allowed finally to import these things. So these things should have been available. Hand sanitizer too. Let the distillers make it. Who cares if someone drinks some alcohol? I mean, alcohol is legal, for heaven's sakes. So yes, have the hand sanitizers available for us. Now, the good news. There is a little bit of good news. And it shows how badly the FDA has been limiting the practice of medicine. Because what they've done is, because of the COVID crisis, they've said, oh, well, we've been limiting telemedicine for a long time, but now we're going to let you do it. And so that's a really good thing. And I think when this ends, doctors are going to say, hey, you're not going to shut us down again. This is too good.
I had my first telemedicine meeting yesterday. I had something that came up that's been bothering me. It's my dermatologist. I just leaned into the screen and the doctor took a look at me. And, to make a mention, I used to work with Dr. Jack Moncrief, a world famous nephrologist, kidney doctor here in town. He is such a cool guy. He came up with the idea of telemedicine and he introduced it to Bush and got Bush to sign a bill to make it legal down the road, even though this was many years ago, but the FDA blocked it. And when you go into his office, he's got all the pictures of him signing the bill with Bush. So that was so cool to know that. And
cool.
I mentioned this to the doctor yesterday when we were on the telemedicine call. Hey, we're doing something that Jack Moncrief here in town set up years ago.
Yes, and along those same lines, they've restricted doctors in the past from using their personal cell phones for telemedicine or taking calls from patients, which means they have to carry a couple of different phones, which is ridiculous. So they've lifted that restriction. Also, a doctor in one state cannot necessarily prescribe in another state unless they've got a license there as well. That's changed as well. They're allowing practice across state lines, which of course never should have been illegal in the first place. And
I wonder if they're going to change that whole thing with the pharmacies, because 3 years ago, they made it illegal for compounding pharmacies in one state, like here in Texas, to ship a product that might not be available in Tennessee to Tennessee. And that's created, unless they have a license in that state. And then they made it harder to get the license in that state. And then they've been removing. So a few months ago, they removed the ability of compounding pharmacists to add aloe vera and turmeric. And then just recently, human chorionic gonadotrophin, it's a pregnancy hormone that we use a lot for weight loss. We use it for endometriosis. It's a fantastic, given sub-Q like an insulin needle for endometriosis. They keep removing things. So do you think any of those things might come back? Have you heard anything about that?
I haven't heard anything about that, unfortunately. And I mean, the FDA has a very strong bias against natural treatments and compounding pharmacies.
Why is that?
Well, I think, again, they want control, and the compounding pharmacies are kind of off doing their thing. And there's definitely...
and I think they're the best healers in the whole world, by the way. I've been teaching them, and I think I respect them as a community almost higher and above everybody. I think they're amazing people, scientists.
Well, there is documentation where the FDA says they feel part of their job is to make sure that the drug companies don't have competition from natural substances. They actually put it in writing, which was
they
really
did? Sweet. Where's that?
Yeah, I'll dig it out and send it to you, and you can.
Oh, that's depressing. This is the uplifting part of our job.
So, it's really...
So talk a minute about that. So you're saying that the FDA has somewhere in writing that part of their goal is to limit competition of big pharma, that there is that collaborative understanding between these two institutes, if you want to put big pharma as a group.
Well, I don't know if I'd say it's a collaboration. I think it's more that the document was issued at a time when the people at the FDA did not feel like any natural remedies were any good. They were all quackery. In fact, that's what they used to call it back then, quackery. Of course, we know
from Quicksilver from the dentist, right? Just wait till one of their loved ones can't get well from a regular intervention and they need something else. It's such a short-sighted. It makes it so awful for the rest of us. It really does.
Well, that's right. Well, actually, in fact, just a little aside here about an FDA regulator who did have that experience, not with natural compounds, but with delays. He was in the cancer section, and he would delay approval of cancer drugs unless the company did a study that was so long that it showed that people lived longer than untreated people, that people weren't treated with their product, right? So this lengthens the time of approval. And of course, when you lengthen the time of approval, that means if the drug is life-saving, people are dying while they're waiting for this drug to be approved. So his wife got cancer, and he found it was very hard to get her in a clinical study because she didn't meet the qualifications. So it took quite a while, and by the time they were able to do it, she basically was on her last legs and died. So now, in his own words, he is on a jihad to get cancer drugs quickly out of the FDA.
Now, when it happens to you, it's such a sin, and that is a short-sightedness of humanity. We look at things from this egocentric point of view, me, my career, but when it happens to you and you're the one under the rock, then all of a sudden you see the benefit of having a larger picture and more availability for the masses. It makes me want to grind my teeth to powder. I get so aggravated.
Well, and in my book, I estimated from published peer-reviewed studies that the FDA's probably shaved 5 to 10 years off each of our lives, but they've shaved it off their lives too, just as you're saying. And so I think that this may be the fulcrum by which we can change the current paradigm, because once regulators understand that they're hurting themselves and shaving those 5 to 10 years off their lives too, and Congress understands that. In other words, the people who maybe can make some changes understand that, then I think things will change. And so one of the things we need to do in order to get these changes is to get the word out. And that's what I tried to do in my book, Death by Regulation.
You do that in so many ways. You've got a column, you're constantly writing, you're constantly speaking, you go all over the country. But let me get back to the test a second. So the World Health Organization and a lot of about 500 Chinese scientists that early on were working with COVID, they came out with a joint collaborative paper that was published February 24th. In that paper, they said that if you're going to really be testing for COVID, you need to look at a panel of antibodies. I've been getting emails recently. I just got one last night, I think, from Diagnostic Solutions, a company I use for some of my kits for testing various things. They're now testing IgG, IgM. They're doing some nasal swabs. They're doing some fecal swabs, because sometimes the nasal swab doesn't show it up. Sometimes it shows up in a fecal swab. If you were going to do a full-on test, you'd have to look at it northerly and southerly. But how good are our tests? There was some guy that seemed to be an unhinged conspiracy theorist, and he was saying that if people had any kind of vaccination for the flu 10 years prior, they would get a false positive on any COVID test. I don't even know if that's true or where he got that data. Can you comment on the state of the tests, how much we can rely on what they're looking at, and what do you think about all that?
Well, first of all, I have to be real upfront and say I haven't reviewed all the tests. But in general, what these tests do is they have a lot of cross-reactivity with similar viruses. So, for example, the COVID is a SARS virus. So if you have SARS antibodies in your bloodstream and you have a antibody tests that cross-reacts, and some of them do, then you're going to test positive when you might not really be. And there's at least two different types of tests. There's the antibody test to see if you have antibodies floating around in your blood, saying that you've been exposed and are mounting immune reaction. And then there's just ones that look for fragments of the virus, like their RNA, for example. So, and there's a slew of tests out there, and we're still trying to sort out which ones are giving what percent of false negatives or false positives, because when the FDA blocked the importation and the development of tests, that really stymied a lot of the development. And so then it started up again when the FDA said it was okay. So we're sort of behind the eight ball in not having, I should say, the experience with a variety of these tests that are now coming into hospitals and knowing exactly, what the cross reactivity is. So there is still a lot of concern about that. And that's just what happens when you have to develop a test quickly. So if you really want to be sure, you probably need more than one test.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. It looks like you're going to need more than one type of test, not just getting the same test several times. And my other thought is, when you look at the immune system, first, your immune system has an innate immune system response, which isn't antibody related.
Mm-hmm.
You have an innate response where you get all your white blood cells saying, hey, there's a non-self molecule in here. And that, if you got tested right in that period of time, you wouldn't have an antibody yet.
Mm-hmm.
Then it takes so then if you don't get rid of it with that first innate response, which is not antibody driven, then your body says, uh-oh, we got something really big, and the bigger guns come in, and you start to make antibodies. And maybe you make a different antibody than that antibody test checks for, because you make a slew of antibodies. So there's all these pitfalls, it seems to me, depending on timing and type of antibody.
Right. Well, right. And it's probably even more complicated than that, because, you're talking about the initial insult creates inflammation. And in some people, this inflammation goes kind of into overdrive. And that's what, a lot of people are sensitive to. And in other cases, for example, my Estonian colleagues have found that part of the reason, for example, that African Americans, or really Africans living anywhere, may be more susceptible to the virus is one of their protections genetically against malaria is to have a reduced amount of glucose 6 phosphate dehydrogenase. And of course, with that deficiency, there's an inability to handle all these reactive oxygen species that come with this inflammation. And so they're one of the groups of people that are more susceptible. My Estonian colleagues also believe.
What do you mean my Estonian colleagues? Please explain.
Yes, I'm working with a couple Estonian scientists. I'm just
What's an Estonian scientist?
Scientists from Estonia,
Oh, okay, there you go. I wasn't sure. I just want to make sure you threw that out there, and I didn't know if I was missing something. Okay, from Estonia.
No.
Okay.
So they're, where was I?
We were talking about how certain groups have genetic predispositions, so they're more vulnerable.
Right, and this glucose 6 phosphate dehydrogenase is also it's down in obesity, diabetes, hypertension, basically all the things of these susceptible groups. So this may be the key, and this may be why they get sicker. Obviously more work needs to be done to be sure that's the whole story.
It might be the same way with the Indians, because a lot of our Indians living in reservations and also not having access to water. I was talking to one of my best friends in Santa Fe, New Mexico, just retired from being a hospice nurse. And she told me she did a lot of house calls out into the different areas where people had no running water. There were 8 or 9 people living in a trailer, and maybe they have the genetic predisposition, or maybe they also have the environmental surroundings, no water, and people very close together.
They could.
Yeah,
right. Because they're in some sense, they're people of color too. They might have, their roots may be in areas that have great malaria, which, for most of us in North America, that isn't the case. But, they do have darker skin. So, that suggests genetics that may go back to Africa as opposed to Europe. And so that could be an issue.
Very, very interesting. So, what do you think where we're at right now, besides social distancing? Is there any other comment you want to make about what the typical person who's staying at home and listening to this show, and people are listening to this show all over the world, any comments you might want to make in coming close to a close?
Well, I guess I'd just like to reiterate that, in my opinion, if we hadn't had this government interference with the private sector trying to import and create protective gear and tests and hand sanitizer, we would be in a place where we didn't have to shut down our economy. And in fact, even though the Europeans have a lot of problems with the coronavirus, they are actually, a lot of them, sending people back to work. They don't feel that you can sustain an economic shutdown like this. And they're going for what they call herd immunity, which I have some question about anyhow, but I think their idea is, hey, the sooner that our population becomes immune to this coronavirus, the better off we're going to be. And, I think they feel like they cannot handle the economic shutdown. And I have to say, we are in a bit of trouble, because when this is all over, a lot of people will have lost their jobs, because most of this social distancing is hitting the small businesses the most. That's 60% of our jobs. So people are going to be out of work. And the way to counter that and get our economy rebooted is not for a government program, but it's to relax these regulations that keep people from working, because it's not just about the COVID. There are a lot of regulations that really keep people from working. And
do you say those? Which regulations are those? And
Sure. Well, the licensing regulations, we talked about one earlier, where doctors can't practice from across state lines. I mean, there's no reason for that. Their expertise doesn't change when they move to another state and take another test. So, things like that need to be relaxed. And that's true, actually, for a lot of occupations, not just doctors, plumbers, electricians. That's ridiculous. Plus, some of the regulations that we have are just totally to prevent competition. For example, African-American hair braiders have been prosecuted in, I think, something like 5 to 7 states now, because they don't have a cosmetology license, which is about $5,000 and a year's worth of work on average. And it doesn't even teach braiding. It's just a way to protect the hairdressers. So there's a lot of things that we do in this country that protect the people who are already in business and keep out people who really want to provide a service very economically and make their living at it, and they can't. And, it used to be, a good example, it used to be that you had to get a very expensive medallion or taxi license if you wanted to drive your own car as a taxi. Now, thankfully, that has been overturned.
Yeah, Uber was so disruptive, man, in a positive way, except for, some of the outlying abusive cases. It's really been quite extraordinary to see how that opened up that field.
That's right. So
we're talking about this FDA that wants so much licensing, so much control. So when we go, what can we, if we feel like we want the FDA to lighten up with the suggestions, for example, that you're saying, or maybe allow compounding pharmacists to ship? I have a lot of patients that want to get a product that's available in one state and they can't get it to their state. What can people do at the voting booth, or who can they contact? What can the regular person listening to this show do to help this out?
I think one of the biggest things we could all do is write our Congress people, because this crisis has really shown how bad the FDA can really be. Point this out and say, look, we need to have the FDA backing off on these regulations. This is ridiculous. And, then, of course, mention your favorite compounding pharmacy or your favorite health-connected supplement or whatever that has been very helpful to you personally, and say, for example, now I can't get this because I've got to go out of state and the compounding pharmacies can't cross state lines. Go ahead and give a personal example and say, this needs to change, because now the FDA is vulnerable. Everybody always thought the FDA protected us, even though it doesn't. And those, of course, that work in the pharmaceutical arena or healthcare arena know that, but the average person didn't. Now the average person is much more aware of how the FDA harms us. And so now is the time to get in touch with your congressperson and say, hey, this has got to change. And use your favorite example.
So do you think we do need an FDA? And what does the FDA do that's good? What's the good side? What's the sunny side of the FDA?
Well, in theory, we hope that the FDA will keep unsafe drugs from getting off the market, but that hasn't happened. And to give you the example, when they passed the 1962 regulations, they did it with a specific intent that fewer unsafe drugs would get to market. Well, let's look at the data. Prior to 1962, about 2.5% of FDA-approved drugs were pulled from the market because of safety concerns. Since 1962, it's hovered right around 3.3%. In other words, it's gone up, not down like it was supposed to.
Is that because there's more drugs coming out, so that there's a confounding variable in that, or address that?
No, because it's a percentage. So it's a percentage of drugs. But what it is that, they've added 10 years of tests that really don't mean anything, because the reason most unsafe drugs get to market is we can't predict everything that's going to happen. Our science just isn't
because
good
there's
enough.
Molecules that the body's never seen before, but then they shut down the capability of getting in molecules the body has seen before.
Well, that is true. And also, because it's so costly now to get FDA approval, the only drugs, almost exclusively, that are developed by pharmaceutical companies today are ones that take almost, they expect you to take them for years or a lifetime. Well, your body can handle most stuff for a couple months. But if it's got to take it for years or a lifetime, the detoxification process that the body has to do starts depleting your vitamins and minerals, and you get sick. You have a serious side effect. So the side effects have actually gone up, not down. It would have been much better if we had continued to allow non-patentable substances like vitamins to be developed and advertised for their health effects, which of course that just ended with the 1962 amendments, because the FDA got to decide what was effective and how many studies and how costly it had to be to make that point. And they blew it. They really blew it.
I remember when I had you on the show for your book, Death by Regulation, which is a fabulous book, I told you a little bit about my stories. I'm going to make it really short, but this happened to myself. So Dr. Moncrief that I mentioned, the reason I knew him, the doctor that initiated and came up with the idea of telemedicine, he brought organ transplantation to Austin. He opened up the first dialysis center, and he and Dr. Kenneth Burton, another physician from a town outside of Austin, the three of us developed a drug for non-healing wounds for diabetics and dialysis patients. And it was very effective. In 2004, the FDA came out with a notice saying that you could add natural substances to a pharmaceutical constituent. So we put together with a pharmaceutical active, we put in aloe and turmeric and a number of other things in this combination that was very, very effective, much better than what was available on the market, which was Regranex. Well, Regranex was discovered to cause cancer after several applications, and then they changed the regulatory pathway to this very expensive pathway. Our drug did away with the need for debridement. Most people have to go in for wound care and get the wound enlarged to get it to heal. Our drug did away for that. Did away with that. It was it eradicated viruses, funguses, bacteria. It was an analgesic. It was kind of an all-in-one. And a lot of diabetics, for example, will be walking around so worried because if they get a sore on their foot or they know that they could have a problem down the road. Our drug, you could keep on your shelf. It had a long shelf life. And if something came up, you could just use it yourself at home and ward it off. But we couldn't take it through the really expensive pathway.
That's right.
And so everybody lost out on that. Now we saved a whole bunch of limbs in our early testing, but we got shut down by the very process that you're talking about.
Exactly. And that's why we don't have exposure to natural remedies unless we actually go, obviously like you and I, we kind of read the literature. We're fortunate because we're exposed to it. But the average person doesn't have this availability. And they don't necessarily have the know-how to evaluate what they see on the internet about these things either. So, if you don't have professionals out there putting these things on the market, you're not going to be able to really service the population in the way they should be. And we should always try natural first.
It's funny. Dr. Burton, who was one of the doctors in our threesome, he had come up with the understanding that you could use nitroglycerin if you got bit by a brown recluse spider. All you have to do is spray it on there, or you could even use nitrobid cream, which is a nitroglycerin cream, because the whole idea of why brown recluse spider bite is so scary, so awful, sometimes gets you down to surgical wound issues, all these kind of things, is because the venom closes off all the blood supply and the nitroglycerin opens it up. But see, you couldn't make a lot of money on it. You couldn't make a drug on it. Most people don't even know about that this is available. One of my friends just last week, because she's at home, was doing gardening and got bit by a brown recluse spider and just dabbed. She had an old nitroglycerin patch around because her father-in-law was Dr. Burton, and she cut it open and put it on it, and it healed in a few days. But people don't have this because they want a big drug. They want a big wound care intervention so that you have all these people involved in all this time, when you can actually, if you knew this at home, treat yourself in a few days. It's so exasperating that natural, less expensive and more effective, often, especially if you intervene early, these kind of care, these kind of tools aren't available to so many of us. So the thing to do is to write our congressperson, tell them what you feel about the FDA, say what you would like to see the FDA do and what you don't want to see it do anymore. So we don't want to shut it down, but we want it to serve us, not to block us. And then also give your own personal experience with some kind of natural intervention. And which would be the Congress people they should write? The senators, the representatives, the mayors?
The people that are in the Congress people that are in their district, so because these people are the ones that you're going to be voting on next time when they go up for re-election. You want to make sure they know that, this is very important to you and that you vote.
Who do you think that's going to be running for office are the people that understand the nuances of the FDA and might support our perspective in this way? Do you got any people you're thinking of?
Well, I always think in terms of libertarians, because of course they understand this very well. They believe that you should have full choice. And that's not what most Democrats and Republicans believe. They want to tell you what your choices are. So they support things like a lot of FDA regulation. And that's on both sides of the fence. Whereas libertarians say, hey, you are the person who is going to have to benefit or suffer. So it should be your choice.
Now, you know this because you ran on the primary for president. Tell us just a little bit about that. We're about ready to close, but that's pretty interesting. You don't talk to too many people who ran for the primary for president, so just tell us a small amount of that.
Well, actually, libertarians don't have a primary for president. They have a convention at which you're nominated. And so I went for the nomination in 2008, lost by about 40 votes, and have since had so many people come up to me over the last few years saying that they're really sorry they didn't vote for me instead of the other person. So.
Well, you've got my vote. I bet she's got your vote because you're hearing how things contributed to our present isness and what we can do to hopefully make the future brighter and better. That's what we want to look at. What are the facts and how can we improve on them? Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I so appreciate it. Plus, you're now a close girlfriend. You're really a smart plus heart human being, and those are rare to find. And I love when they're more and more in my inner circle because over your whole lifetime, there aren't that many people who are truly authentic, smart plus heart. But you are, Mary. So thank you, Dr. Ruwart, for being on the show.
And thank you for having me, Lindsay. As always, it's a pleasure.
Okay. Be well. Be well. Bye, everybody.